My son's wife laughed at my faded photographs, at the buttoned-up shirts, at the way I stood with my arms crossed, as if I were guarding my own youth. She said men like that weren't needed anymore. I stayed silent. But photographs aren't just paper. They carry shadows of the past. And the past always comes back, especially when it's summoned through mockery, especially when it holds the names she once wrote to my brother in the middle of the night, and whose messages were never deleted. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Walter Hayden. I was 75 years old and had lived in the same red brick house on the corner of East Sycamore and Grove for nearly 4 decades. For most of my life, I worked as a certified public accountant in Lawrence County, Ohio. My job was numbers, columns that needed balancing, forms that needed filing, decimal points that made or broke lives. It was quiet work, consistent, structured. I appreciated that. There was comfort in routine, in patterns. I wore ties long after others abandoned them, kept paper ledgers even when the office switched to cloud-based systems, and I never once submitted a return late. People thought I was rigid. Maybe I was. But it kept things in place, at least for a while. After my wife Margaret passed, I lived alone. The house changed. Or maybe I changed, and the house simply reflected it. Her slippers remained by the bed for over a year. Her favorite mug with the faded floral pattern stayed at the back of the cupboard, untouched. The curtains stayed drawn in the guest room where she used to read. Her ghost didn't haunt the house. It breathed through it, like dust settling on old books. Every sound felt louder, and every silence more deliberate. Then my son Adam called. He and his wife needed a temporary place to stay. Just a couple of months while their contractor finished the flooring in their new home. It wasn't a favor. It was more of an expectation. He framed it as a logical decision. They had nowhere else to go, and my place had extra space. I didn't argue. I said yes. Maybe I thought the noise would soften the loneliness. Maybe I was just tired of saying no. They arrived in early spring, when the grass still had brown patches and the air smelled like thawed soil. She brought throw pillows, decorative candles, and a blender. He brought boxes of tools and a digital speaker that hummed quietly in the background, even when no one asked it to. Within days, the house began to shift. Furniture was moved for better flow. The books on the coffee table were replaced with fashion magazines and yoga catalogs. My old recliner was pushed closer to the window, like a display. I tried to be gracious. I gave them the master bedroom upstairs with its wide windows and soft mattress. I moved myself into the small room downstairs that Margaret once used for sewing. The light was dimmer there. The floor creaked. But I told myself it was temporary. One evening, after dinner, I went to the hall closet and pulled out an old photo album. The leather was cracked and the binding loose. The pages smelled faintly of glue and time. I carried it to the dining table, where we still sat with half-empty plates and 2 glasses of white wine. Hers and Adam's. Mine was a chipped ceramic mug with tea. I opened the album slowly, letting the pages fall where they may. The first photo was from 1973. I was 23, standing beside my father's truck in a plaid shirt, squinting against the sun. My arms were crossed over my chest in that awkward way people pose when they don't know what to do with their hands. Margaret stood beside me in a white dress with tiny polka dots. Her smile was small, gentle, almost uncertain. A burst of laughter shattered the room. It came from her, my daughter-in-law, Alice. She laughed so hard she had to set her wine down, covering her mouth with the back of her hand. "Is that you?" she asked, although she clearly knew it was. "You look like an old-timey farmer. What are you even wearing?" I said nothing. Adam chuckled, not quite looking at me. He leaned back in his chair and scrolled on his phone. She kept flipping through the pages, laughing at the hairstyles, the clothes, the way we stood. She mocked Margaret's dress, saying it looked like a curtain. She mocked the background, the muddy driveway, the folding chairs in our first backyard. To her, the photos were entertainment, quirky relics from a life too plain, too modest, too unpolished for her taste. But to me, each image was a map. Each wrinkle in the photo paper held a memory of hands held during uncertain years, of first paychecks, of scraped knees, of long winters warmed by simple dinners and the sound of someone breathing beside you. I watched her laugh at my life, not just at my clothes or my hair, at my posture, at my stillness, at the way I stood with my arms folded. She saw a caricature. I saw a man who spent decades doing everything right, paying bills on time, mowing the lawn every Saturday, holding his wife's hand through 3 miscarriages, clapping with pride at his son's graduation, even when his back ached from shoveling snow the night before. She turned a page and laughed again. I wanted to speak, to say something, but my throat felt dry, as if dust had filled it. I sipped my tea. It had gone cold. Later that night, after they had gone upstairs and I had washed the dishes alone, I sat with the album again, in silence. I ran my fingers over the photos. I could still remember the smell of Margaret's shampoo, the softness of her hand on my shoulder, the way she always blinked twice when nervous. I remembered the tremble in her voice when she said she wanted to keep our first house, even when it meant eating beans for a month. I remembered how we danced in the kitchen, barefoot, when the mortgage was finally paid off. The next morning, the album was back on the shelf. The laughter still echoed faintly, but the pages remained closed. Not because I was ashamed, but because I had started to realize something. There's a kind of silence that isn't absence, it's observation. It's the patience of someone who knows the value of things others dismiss. I had always thought silence meant weakness, but that morning, it felt like armor. They had moved into my house, but I was still here, and so were the photos, and they were watching. I had always kept my house in a state of quiet order, not sterile, not fussy, but balanced. Everything had a place. The front door had a creak, the hallway had a particular draft in winter, and the radiator in the guest room hissed on cold nights. I knew these things like I knew the back of my hand. Margaret and I had arranged the furniture in a way that caught the morning sun just right. We had chosen curtains to match the seasons, light linen for spring, thick velvets for the snowy months. I had a drawer in the kitchen just for old tools, a shelf in the basement labeled for light bulbs. Even after she was gone, I kept things in place. It was how I held on to her, in absence. When Adam and Alice moved in, it began with little changes. At first, I didn't resist. They brought their own pillows, their own coffee machine, their own stack of sparkling water bottles that filled the fridge. My tea and milk were slowly nudged to the corner shelf. My grocery list, once taped to the fridge, disappeared. I found it days later, crumpled in the bin under a takeout container from a sushi place I'd never heard of. I smoothed it out and kept it folded in my wallet. The front door key was still under the terracotta frog by the porch, where it had always been. One day I found the frog moved. Not far, just turned slightly. The key inside was warm to the touch, as if it had been held not long before. I asked no questions, but I knew. They had made copies, probably for convenience, probably without thinking. But something about it stung. That key had once been handed only to friends, to neighbors I trusted, to family in case of emergency. Now it was duplicated without a word, its meaning reduced to metal. A few days later, I noticed that the Wi-Fi password had been changed. Not a major thing, not to most people. But I'd written it down in a small notebook with Margaret's handwriting on the first page. When I asked Adam, he shrugged and said something about upgrading security. The new password was saved on their devices, not mine. I had to ask for it twice. The second time, Alice laughed and said, You should just let us handle the tech stuff. As if my memory was no longer trustworthy. As if decades of calculating other people's finances didn't count for much anymore. More things shifted. A new lamp appeared in the hallway, one with a cold LED light that made the space feel sterile. My old books were stacked in a box labeled "Donate" and pushed into the corner of the garage. My slippers were missing one day. I found them later, tossed in the laundry room behind a basket of unwashed clothes. I stopped asking questions. I started keeping a list instead, not for confrontation, just for clarity. Every morning I woke earlier than them. I always had. I liked the quiet of the house before the day settled in. I boiled water for tea, fed the birds in the backyard, and sometimes sat by the window with a crossword. One morning I noticed the sugar jar was nearly empty. I always kept it full, out of habit. I refilled it. 2 days later, it was empty again. Not low, empty. I had never seen them use sugar, but someone had. I didn't say a word. There was a pale blue dish I kept near the stove, a shallow bowl where Margaret used to place her wedding ring when she cooked. I had left it there for years. It had a chip on one side and a faint pattern of vines that had faded over time. One evening, it was gone. I searched quietly. I found it on the top shelf above the stove, behind a stack of new spice jars with modern labels and plastic lids. The dish was turned upside down, as if to hide it. When I reached for it, I nearly knocked over a jar labeled nutritional yeast. I didn't know what that was. I returned the dish to its spot by the stove. Later that week, I took my old camera out of its case. It was a 35mm Minolta, the one I used to carry on family trips. It had dust in the viewfinder and a slight crack in the corner, but it still worked. I planned to take some pictures of the daffodils blooming near the fence. I set the camera on the console table in the hallway before going to get my coat. When I returned, the camera was gone. I checked every room. It wasn't in the drawer, not on the windowsill, not in my room, not in the garage. I found it 3 days later in the laundry room, placed awkwardly beside a bag of winter scarves. The battery compartment had been opened. The lens cap was missing. I held it in my hand, turned it over gently, and didn't say a word. I placed it back in its case and locked it in the filing cabinet in the basement. I hadn't locked anything in that cabinet since 2004. It was then that I understood. This wasn't a war. It wasn't even hostility. It was erosion. Slow, daily, patient erosion. Of space. Of memory. Of small rituals that made my days feel like mine. The light in the hallway felt different now. My footsteps echoed more. The walls, once filled with the soft creak of Margaret's voice, were now lined with scented oils and electronic chargers. I passed mirrors where I once adjusted my tie before work, and now saw only a man who had been quietly shifted to the side. The key under the frog was still there, but I started carrying mine in my pocket again. I checked the locks twice before bed. I unplugged the speaker in the living room. I folded my laundry and placed it in my own drawers, even though the new basket Alice had bought sat right next to the dryer. I didn't want confrontation. I didn't need apology. I wanted recognition, not in words, not in thanks, in space, in a sugar jar not emptied without notice, in a dish left where it belonged, in a house that still remembered who built it. That was all I asked. But I knew, even then, that asking had never been the problem. It was being heard. It started with a pillow, a small one, marigold yellow with faded embroidery. Margaret had stitched it herself during the long autumn of '88, when the furnace went out, and we spent weekends under blankets watching reruns and sipping cider. The threads were uneven in places. Her eyesight had started to waver. But the center of the design was intact, a small oak leaf surrounded by imperfect swirls. That pillow had lived on the armchair in the living room for decades. It wasn't decorative, really. It was memory, fabric holding time. One morning, I noticed it was gone. The armchair sat bare, its arms exposed like stripped branches. At first I thought maybe it had slipped behind the cushion. Then I checked under the couch, behind the bookshelf, in the linen closet. Nowhere. I found it 2 days later in a box labeled seasonal decor in the garage, nestled between a plastic pumpkin and an unopened packet of metallic tinsel. It was folded, tucked away as if it were something to be ashamed of. I didn't put it back. Not yet. I took it to my room and placed it on the bed beside the pillow I slept on. At night I would brush my hand over the stitching. I could almost hear Margaret's hum, that quiet tune she used to repeat while sewing. A tune with no lyrics, just comfort. They began replacing more things. The blue checkered curtains in the kitchen, the ones Margaret had hemmed to fit the window perfectly, were replaced with pale gray drapes that hung too long and dragged on the tile. The embroidered dish towels disappeared, replaced with white ones that had no softness, no memory. The oil painting of Lake Erie that we bought from a local artist was swapped for a canvas print of abstract shapes in beige and navy. Everything that had warmth, that had a story, was slowly replaced with items that had no past. Alice said nothing, but I could see her taste bleeding into every corner. She preferred white, silver, gray, and black, colors that made rooms feel colder, as if warmth had become distasteful, as if color meant clutter. I had once read that some people preferred minimalism because it made them feel clean, but to me, it just felt erased. One afternoon, I caught sight of her in the backyard, trimming the azaleas by the fence. She was wearing a long beige cardigan, and her hair was pulled back tightly. I stepped out to say something, maybe about the pruning shears she was using, maybe about the fact that those flowers usually bloomed in spring, not fall. But when she saw me, she smiled in that tight, polite way and turned back toward the garden. I stood on the porch for a few moments and went back inside. Later that week, the tablecloth in the dining room was replaced. The old one, red with a pattern of sunflowers, had small wine stains and a bit of fraying along the edge. I had planned to take it to a cleaner. Instead, I found it wadded up in the laundry basket, half damp and sour-smelling. In its place was a thin white runner that barely covered the center of the table. It looked like something from a hotel lobby, cold, temporary. I didn't eat at the table that night. There was a small glass bowl that sat on the hallway table, green and imperfect, blown by hand by a local craftsman Margaret admired. It had once held keys, loose coins, and sometimes folded notes reminding us of appointments. One evening I passed by and saw it had been replaced with a chrome tray, shiny, fingerprint-resistant, empty. Every color that once held presents had vanished. The yellow of the daffodil vase, the dusty rose of the rug we bought in 1995, the forest green of the throw blanket Margaret used when she had the flu. Gone. Even the photos in the hallway had been rearranged, reduced, reframed, desaturated. One day, I overheard her on the phone in the kitchen. I hadn't meant to listen, but I was passing through the hallway, and her voice carried. She was talking about curating the space, about how she couldn't stand grandma-style clutter. She said it made her feel claustrophobic, that it was aesthetic pollution. I stood by the stairs, hearing her voice flatten decades into decor. My life, my memories, my choices, reduced to pollution. That night, I went to the basement and pulled out a box labeled Margaret's Keepsakes. Inside were fabric swatches, sketches, dried flowers pressed between wax paper, letters, and color samples she had once clipped from magazines. She had loved color. She said it reminded her that life was still blooming, even in the dullest seasons. I took out the swatch of marigold fabric, the same she used for the pillow. I pinned it to the corkboard above my desk, just a square of yellow, nothing more. In the days that followed, I started returning small items to their places. I didn't ask permission. I didn't announce it. I placed the sunflower tablecloth back on the table. I put the green bowl back on the hallway table. I rehung the painting of Lake Erie. Nothing large, nothing confrontational, just color, creeping back in like moss between bricks. She said nothing, but I noticed her eyes lingered longer on certain objects. I saw the tightness in her jaw when she folded the sunflower cloth and replaced it with the white runner again. We were locked in a silent exchange, a push and pull of tones and textures, my memories against her design. One morning I brewed tea and sat by the window. The sky was pale and frost clung to the grass. The marigold pillow was still in my room. I didn't move it. I didn't hide it. I just let it be. There are colors some people can't bear, not because they're ugly, but because they mean something, because they refuse to disappear. I wasn't trying to win. I wasn't trying to fight. I was trying to remember. And that was enough. It was early March when I finally decided to go through the attic. I hadn't been up there in months, maybe longer. The narrow staircase creaked under my weight, and the air grew colder with each step. There was a dampness to it, a familiar mustiness that reminded me of newspaper ink and forgotten cardboard. I hadn't touched most of those boxes since Margaret passed, and even then I'd only moved them to make room for things I no longer used. But something had been tugging at me for days, a quiet instinct that told me to look. The insulation was peeling in one corner, and a spider had spun a web over a broken lamp. I turned on the dusty bulb hanging from the rafters and looked around. I knew what I was searching for, though I hadn't admitted it to myself yet. I moved aside holiday decorations, old coats, and a box labeled college papers. In the back, behind a stack of Margaret's knitting supplies, I found the box. It was small and unmarked. Inside it, I had kept old electronics, mostly things I no longer used. There was a cracked flip phone, a Walkman missing its cover, a digital camera with a dead battery, and at the bottom, wrapped in a faded kitchen towel, was the tablet. I'd forgotten about it entirely. A gift from Adam for Christmas 8 years ago. I'd used it off and on for checking the weather or watching the occasional baseball highlight. But after Margaret's decline, I stopped. It reminded me too much of silence, of evenings spent alone, pretending to scroll just to fill the void. I brought it downstairs and set it on the kitchen table. It took a while to power on. The screen flickered once, then again, and finally lit up with the old lock screen, Margaret's hands in the garden, holding a ripe tomato. I had taken that photo. I stood there for a long time, not ready to unlock it. My fingers hesitated, but muscle memory still recalled the passcode. The screen unlocked, and for a moment I saw nothing but apps, weather, email, an old recipe book. Then a notification popped up. It was from the messaging app I hadn't used in years. The icon glowed softly in the top corner. I tapped it. And there they were. Messages. Dozens of them. Some sent, some received. All dated in the past few months. I felt a heaviness settle in my chest. The sender was Alice. The recipient was listed as G. I didn't know a G in her circle. But as I scrolled further, I saw the messages contained familiar phrases, details, a nickname only one person ever used in our family. My brother. G stood for Gregory, my older brother, 5 years my senior. We had grown apart over the years, not out of conflict, just distance, different lives, different rhythms. He had always been louder, brasher, better with charm. I had been the quiet one. He worked in sales. I worked in ledgers. But blood is blood, and I had always believed in that. The first message was harmless, a thank you note for something he had dropped off, then a joke, then a photo, then a string of responses too late in the night to be accidental. There were flirtations, subtle at first, then explicit. I scrolled through, numb. It wasn't the content that stunned me. It was the tone, familiarity, ease, a language of shared secrecy. She told him about the house, About me. About Adam. About how she felt trapped in tradition. How the walls felt like a funeral home with furniture. She mocked my routines, my habits, the way I stirred my tea with a spoon instead of using a stir stick. She said I hovered like a ghost. He responded with laughter, jokes, affirmations. He told her she deserved more. He called her firecracker. She signed one message with a heart. I sat in that chair for hours, reading. I didn't cry. I didn't feel rage. Just a hollowing out. Like something inside me had quietly caved in. I kept thinking about the marigold pillow, the vanished tablecloth, the way my books had been boxed up without comment. All of it pointed here. Not to malice, not to violence, but to disrespect disguised as lifestyle. It was erasure through design. Gregory had been to the house a few times recently. He said it was to check on me. I had offered him tea, shown him Margaret's old journal, even walked him through the garden, telling him my plans to replant the hydrangeas. He had listened with that familiar half-smile, that same old nod, the nod I'd mistaken for brotherly warmth. But now I understood. He wasn't visiting me. He was circling. I thought about Adam. Did he know? Did he suspect? Or was he just as peripheral as I had become in my own home? The thought of telling him felt useless. Not because I lacked proof. I had screenshots, timestamps, words that cut like blades. But because I wasn't sure he'd believe me. Or worse, he'd believe me, and still choose silence. The tablet buzzed once more. A new message. I didn't open it. I powered the device off, wrapped it in the towel again, and placed it inside the filing cabinet in the basement. The one with the fireproof lock. I hadn't used that cabinet in years. It used to store our tax returns, Margaret's insurance papers, letters from old friends. Now it held something different. Not evidence, not ammunition, just clarity. That night, I walked through the house and touched the objects they hadn't yet removed. The cracked vase, the small wooden cross above the doorway, the stitched calendar Margaret made in '91. I whispered their names in my mind, not out loud, just a private roll call of what was still mine. And I promised myself something I hadn't said in years. I would not be moved. Not from this house, not from this history, not from the truth. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of evening that slid in quietly, unnoticed. The sky outside was a dull, steady gray, the kind that settled low on the rooftops and made the wind feel heavier than it should. I had spent the better part of the afternoon in the garage, reorganizing old boxes that had been shoved aside to make space for Adam's power tools and Alice's exercise equipment. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. Maybe I just needed to touch the past with my hands, to feel something that hadn't been altered or repurposed. I found a rusted tin of screws, a stack of yellowing gas bills from 1992, a jar filled with marbles Margaret once used for centerpieces. I lingered on the marbles longer than I expected. When I came back into the house, the smell of roasted chicken hung in the air. Not quite like Margaret used to make it. Her chicken had a smell of butter and thyme, always with a hint of lemon. But this was different. Sharper. It smelled like something from a package. The kitchen lights were on, too bright. The kind of white light that made the counter feel like a hospital tray. They were already sitting at the dining table when I entered. Alice was pouring wine into 2 tall glasses, swirling it like she had seen it done on television. Adam sat at the head of the table, where I once did. It had been his seat now for a few weeks, maybe months. I hadn't noticed the exact moment when he claimed it. That bothered me more than it should have. There was a plate set for me, off to the side, near the edge of the table. A different plate than theirs. Mine was one of the old ceramic ones with the brown ring around the edge, while theirs were new and white, slick and silent when placed down. I took my seat slowly, folding my hands in my lap before lifting the fork. No one looked up. Dinner was not unpleasant. The food was fine. The room was warm, but something about it felt performative, like everyone had memorized a script. Adam talked about a meeting he had with a client who wanted to expand their property, how zoning laws were changing, how the firm was pushing him for more weekend availability. I nodded, chewing. He didn't ask how my day had been. Alice smiled through the entire meal. Not once did her lips press into a line. It was a smile that showed all her teeth, sharp and white and constant. She commented on the wine, on the texture of the chicken, on how the new curtains made the room feel more breathable. Her voice was clear, just loud enough, like someone narrating a show that she wasn't really part of. At one point she laughed, not at a joke, but at something she said herself, a high, ringing laugh that bounced off the walls and settled into my spine like a cold needle. She tilted her head, touched Adam's wrist, and said something about how she had always wanted a house with character. The way she said it, I could feel the italics, the irony. I looked down at my plate. I noticed then that the tablecloth had changed again. It was another new one, light gray, barely textured. It reminded me of ash. The old one, the red one with the floral border, was gone. Probably boxed, probably labeled donate. I couldn't remember the last time I saw it. The centerpiece had changed, too. Gone were the dried wildflowers that Margaret used to arrange each season. Now there was a low, polished bowl filled with smooth white stones and a single black candle in the center. It looked like something you'd find in a waiting room. Clean, controlled, silent. Alice turned to me and asked if the chicken was too dry. Her voice was sweet, but her eyes were already looking away. I nodded, said it was fine. She smiled again, almost too quickly, and went back to her glass. I took another bite and tried not to think about the messages I'd read the night before. They were still with me, crowding the air around me, threading through every polite word and manufactured laugh. They had not faded. If anything, the quiet civility of the dinner made them louder. I watched how Alice leaned toward Adam, how her fingers brushed his sleeve, how her gaze lingered when he spoke. It wasn't affection, it was ownership, territory marked by performance. I stared at the candle in the center of the table and remembered how Margaret used to light 3 small ones during winter dinners. She said 3 flames reminded her of the 3 of us, me, her, and Adam. That even in silence, we were together. That small light could keep the cold out. This single black candle burned without flicker. It did not warm. It did not speak. After dinner, they cleared the plates. Alice carried mine before I had a chance to lift it. She smiled again and said I should relax. That word again, relax. It was what people said when they were about to remove your voice from the room. I sat alone at the table for a while. The candle still burned. The stones gleamed under the overhead light. I heard water running in the sink, the clink of dishes, the low hum of the dishwasher. Then came silence. I rose, walked to the side cabinet, and opened the second drawer. Inside was a stack of old postcards, a few receipts, and a bundle of keys. I found the small one, the one with the blue tag. It belonged to the drawer in the hallway, the drawer where Margaret had kept letters. I had left it untouched for years. I went to the hallway and opened it. Inside were envelopes tied with a red ribbon. I untied them slowly, as if unwrapping something fragile. Letters from Margaret to her sister. Notes she'd written to me and never gave. Lists of flowers she wanted to plant. Ideas for the quilt she never finished. At the bottom was a card, a thank you card from Gregory, my brother. It was dated 3 years ago, after Margaret's funeral. His handwriting was loose, hurried. He wrote about how strong I was, how proud she would have been, how I should keep the place warm. That last sentence echoed in my head. I returned to the dining table, now cleared. The candle was still burning, the stones untouched. I blew it out. The room went dim. I looked around and realized that nothing on the table had come from us. Not from me, not from Margaret. Every piece was curated, selected, placed, like we were being slowly rewritten. The smile at the dining table wasn't warmth, it was strategy, and I had been sitting in it the whole time. It had been several months since I'd last seen Gregory face to face. My older brother had always carried himself like a man half his age, with hair slicked back and 2 white teeth that never quite matched the color of his skin. We were different in almost every way imaginable. He was charming, where I was quiet, spontaneous where I was cautious, a storyteller where I was a listener. We grew up in the same 3-bedroom house with creaky floors and mismatched wallpaper, but we chose different exits out of that life. Gregory ran toward the world. I learned how to hold still inside it. When we were boys, I admired him. He seemed fearless. He could talk himself out of anything, convince our father to let him borrow the car, charm our mother out of grounding him. I tried to follow his lead once or twice, but I never had the timing. I was always the one holding the flashlight while he climbed out the window. He laughed more easily than I did. He made others laugh too. Even now, at 79, he still had that boyish spark, that lopsided grin, like he was always on the edge of confessing something mildly criminal and getting away with it. That grin was gone when he showed up at my front door. He didn't knock. He called from the porch, loud enough that I heard it through the living room windows. When I opened the door, he had one hand in his pocket and the other holding a coffee, half full and lukewarm. I hadn't invited him. He hadn't told me he was coming. But there he stood, acting like it was the most natural thing in the world. I stepped aside and let him in. He commented on the weather, said something about the wind biting sharper than usual. I nodded and led him to the kitchen. The chairs were new. Alice's doing. They were too tall for the table and made your legs dangle awkwardly. Gregory didn't seem to notice. He sat and crossed one leg over the other, tapping his foot lightly as he looked around the room. He didn't compliment the decor. That was my first clue. Usually he would have said something about the color palette, or the modern look, or at least made a joke about my taste finally evolving past 1984. But he stayed quiet. His eyes lingered on the fruit bowl, the cordless phone, the smudge on the cabinet that hadn't been there yesterday. It was as if he was scanning the room for something he'd misplaced. I poured him a cup of tea and set it down in front of him without asking if he wanted any. He thanked me, but didn't drink. I sat across from him and waited. He started with small talk, asked about my knees, the furnace, the garden. I answered plainly. Nothing elaborate, nothing warm. I kept my hands on the table, palms flat, as if to remind myself I was grounded. He looked older than I remembered. His skin sagged slightly under his eyes. There was a tremble in his left hand when he picked up the cup. But what struck me more was the hesitancy. Gregory had never hesitated in his life. He always spoke like the world owed him an audience. But now he paused between sentences, as if measuring each word against a ledger I couldn't see. At one point, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a slip of paper. I watched as he unfolded it slowly. It was a receipt from a cafe in town, dated 3 weeks ago. 2 items, a latte and an almond croissant. He slid it across the table and said something about the pastry being overpriced. I didn't laugh. He left it there. I realized then that he wasn't here for casual company. He was waiting to see what I would say, waiting to see if I knew. And I did. I knew about the messages. I knew about the long pauses during Alice's phone calls, the half-excuses she gave when leaving the house alone, the sudden interest Gregory had shown in checking in on his little brother. I knew the way her laughter had changed, becoming sharper, more performative. I knew the way he avoided my eyes when they were both in the same room, but I said nothing. Gregory shifted in his seat. His foot stopped tapping. He looked down at the cup and then back at me. He started to speak, twice, but both times he stopped himself. That was when I saw it. The shadow. Not on his face exactly, but behind his eyes. A flicker of guilt, or maybe fear. A recognition. He knew I knew, and he didn't know what I would do with that knowledge. I let the silence stretch. The old grandfather clock in the hallway struck 4. The chimes echoed faintly through the house. Gregory looked toward the sound, then back at me. He finally asked how I'd been sleeping. I told him I slept just fine. He smiled. It was small, fragile. He said that was good, that sleep was important, that he had trouble with it sometimes. I nodded. He didn't mention Alice. Not once. Didn't ask how she was. Didn't bring up the house. Didn't even touch on the subject of Adam. That omission was the loudest thing he said all afternoon. When he left, he didn't hug me. He patted my shoulder, awkwardly, like a man comforting a stranger at a funeral. I watched him walk down the front path, his gait a little slower, his spine a little less straight. The wind lifted the edge of his coat as he reached the car. He didn't look back. That night, I sat in the living room with the lights off. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't open a book. I just sat there, listening to the old radiator knock softly in the corner. My hands were still on the arms of the chair, fingers pressed into the worn fabric. I thought about the receipt he'd left on the table. Not because it proved anything, but because it didn't have to. It was the kind of thing you leave behind when you want to say something without saying it, when you're not brave enough to confess, but not cruel enough to pretend. I didn't throw it away. I folded it neatly and placed it inside the front cover of Margaret's favorite gardening book. I didn't need a reminder, but I wanted one. It came back to me in the laundry room, not as a thought, but as a smell. A faint trace of cologne, not the kind Adam ever wore, and certainly not something I kept in the house. It was heavier than what I remembered from my own youth, more modern, but not unfamiliar. I had smelled it before, many times, on jackets and collars, at family gatherings, at funerals. It was Gregory's. It was clinging to one of the towels hanging near the dryer. I stood there for a while, just breathing in the air, trying to convince myself I was mistaken. Maybe Alice had bought something new, a detergent or a spray. But that particular scent had a shape in my memory. Gregory always wore cologne too generously. He once joked that subtlety was for cowards. I used to laugh, but not anymore. I folded the towel and placed it in the basket. The next day, I returned to the laundry room, opened the lid of the hamper, and lifted one of the shirts Alice had washed. It was black, fitted, a brand I'd never seen Adam wear. The size tag read M. Adam hadn't worn medium since college. I held the shirt in my hands and smelled the collar. The same scent, embedded, not recent. I didn't confront anyone. There was nothing to say that would sound like a question instead of an accusation, and I had no interest in chasing shadows. I simply observed. That had become my role in this house. Observer, quiet fixture, the man whose presence blended into wallpaper. But I learned to see through quiet, to listen through absence. Later that week, I noticed another change. Alice had reorganized the bathroom cabinets. My aftershave had been moved to the back. In its place sat a new bottle of moisturizer, unscented, expensive-looking, with a brand name I couldn't pronounce. On the counter was a second toothbrush, not Adam's. His was blue. This one was white and slimmer. I had never seen it before. That night, I sat in my room with the old photo albums spread out on the bed. Margaret had labeled everything with neat handwriting, dates, names, locations. There was one picture of me and Gregory from our early 20s, standing near the truck our father left us. I studied the photo for a long time. We were both smiling, arms crossed like brothers do in movies. But I remembered how he had taken the keys first. Always first. The next day, I opened the drawer near the front door. The mail sat in a messy pile, unsorted. Among the flyers and bills was an envelope with Gregory's handwriting. I hadn't received anything from him in months. It was a short note, no return address, no date. It simply said, "Let's not let things grow too far apart." I didn't know if he meant the physical distance or the silence. I placed the envelope in the desk drawer without responding. Alice started spending more time in the backyard. She said she was starting a garden, though I rarely saw her with tools. She paced a lot, sat in the old wicker chair Margaret once used. One day I noticed her on the phone. Her voice was low, her back to the house, her hand covering her mouth. When she turned around and saw me through the window, she smiled. A reflex. Too fast. Too clean. A few nights later, I smelled the cologne again, this time in the hallway. It wasn't strong, just a trace, like someone had passed through recently. I followed the trail to the guest bathroom. The light was off. The room was empty, but the air still held the memory of someone who had stood there, too long, too close. I began keeping a small notebook in my drawer, just a list, not for revenge, not for proof, for clarity. A black shirt, a white toothbrush, a faint mark on the hallway wall that hadn't been there before. A wine glass left in the sink when Adam had been away on business. A second car key left out on the kitchen table. Details, dates, fragments. I didn't share the list with anyone. I didn't even reread it. Writing it down was enough. It kept my mind sharp. It gave me control over the fog. That weekend, Gregory didn't show up, but his cologne did. The smell was strongest in the living room, near the fireplace. I checked the back door. It wasn't locked. Alice said she must have forgotten. Adam was out of town again. For work, she said. The way she always said it, like it was a fact too boring to question. I sat in the living room that night and stared at the cold ashes in the hearth. I remembered all the nights Margaret and I sat there, wrapped in the quilt she made by hand. I remembered how the fire cracked and popped, and how she used to reach for my hand without looking. She hated the smell of cologne. It gave her headaches. I watched the shadows on the walls until they stopped moving. Then I stood, walked into the kitchen, and opened the bottom drawer. There, behind the linens, was the tablet I had stored after reading the messages. I hadn't touched it since. I powered it on. The battery was still half full. There were new messages. I didn't read them. I turned the screen off and placed the tablet face down. I had no interest in seeing what I already knew. The weight of it was enough. The knowing was complete. Guilt has a smell. Not sharp like fear, not sour like regret. It's subtle, lingering. It settles into fabric and silence. You can't scrub it out. It returns with heat and breath and memory, and in this house, it had begun to cling to everything. There's a kind of stillness that doesn't calm you. It sharpens you. That was the kind of stillness that began to take hold of the house in early April. Not the peace of a quiet morning, but the heavy pause before a storm. The air was thicker. The rooms had weight. Even the walls seemed to breathe slower, like they were holding in a secret they didn't want to tell. I stopped playing the radio in the mornings. I stopped opening the blinds in the kitchen. The light felt dishonest somehow, like it was trying too hard to make things look normal. I had always believed that silence was neutral, that it could be a place of rest, or at the very least, a buffer between what was and what might be. But now I understood it differently. Silence could be laced with intentions. It could hum like a wire, quietly carrying the energy of betrayal just beneath the surface. Alice had begun to move more like a guest than a resident. Her routines shifted. She avoided lingering in shared spaces. She used her phone in corners, behind half-closed doors, with her back turned. I rarely heard her speak above a whisper anymore, and when she did, it was only to say things like, "I'll be right back," or "just stepping outside for a minute." Each sentence felt carefully edited, airbrushed of emotion, trimmed of truth. Adam was gone more often than usual. Business trips, he said. Meetings in Cleveland, a conference in Chicago, a site visit in Cincinnati. I didn't question him, not because I believed him, but because I no longer believed that questions were the way forward. There was a kind of clarity that only came through watching. One night, after they had both left the house, she to the grocery store, him to a client dinner, I walked the perimeter, not with suspicion, but with purpose. I checked doors, windows, drawers. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, and yet I found myself opening things I hadn't touched in years. The linen closet, the drawer where Margaret kept our insurance papers, a wooden chest in the guest room filled with board games and old VHS tapes. Behind the chest, wedged awkwardly into the corner of the closet, was a small paper bag. It was crumpled, worn along the seams. Inside were two things: a receipt from a jewelry store dated 6 weeks earlier, and a handwritten note. The note was folded twice, stained along the crease. It was short, only 3 words: "You deserve better." I didn't recognize the handwriting, but the signature was familiar. A single initial, G. I replaced the note without reading it again. I didn't need to. It wasn't about proof. It was about shape. The shape of something taking form beneath the surface, like a ripple forming in a well before the water knows it's been touched. That night, I dreamt of water. Not the sea or a river, but a well. The kind with stone walls and a wooden frame. The kind found in stories where wishes go to die. In the dream, I dropped a bucket down, and when I pulled it up, the water was murky. I reached in and felt both warmth and cold, as if 2 currents had merged and were struggling against each other. When I looked closer, I saw faces in the water. Not full reflections, just pieces. An eye, a mouth, a smile that wasn't real. I woke before dawn and sat at the edge of the bed for a long time. Later that morning, I found Alice in the kitchen pouring herself coffee. She turned when she saw me and offered the same polished smile I had come to expect. I nodded. She asked if I needed anything. I said no. She stood there for a moment, holding the mug like it was heavier than it looked. Then she turned and walked out. The smell of her perfume lingered behind her, a different one than usual. Lighter, almost unfamiliar. The next day, I walked past the guest room and noticed the door slightly ajar. Something was different about the bed. The pillows had been rearranged, the blanket folded in a new way. On the nightstand was a glass of water that hadn't been there the day before. The lamp had been moved an inch closer to the wall. These were not big things, but I noticed. I stepped into the room and stood there, letting the air settle around me. It smelled like cologne again. Not strong, not fresh, but settled, like the scent of someone who had been there and left just before you arrived. The window was open, just a crack. I closed it, slowly, and left the room. In the days that followed, I began to think of the house as a body. Each room an organ, each drawer, closet, and hallway a vein carrying memory, conflict, and whatever this new thing was, a mix of comfort and corrosion. The floors creaked differently now, like they were trying to warn me. The lights flickered in the den once, and I stared at the ceiling for almost an hour, waiting for something to fall. Nothing did. Gregory hadn't visited again, not officially, not during the day. But twice I thought I saw a car slow near the house. Once in the early morning, once just before dusk. A black sedan, unmarked, windows tinted. Both times, it kept moving. Both times I stood by the window and watched until the road was empty again. There was a moment that stayed with me. It happened in the backyard. I was pulling weeds near the fence line when I heard laughter from inside the house. It was sharp, short, the kind of laugh that isn't real but is used to fill space. Then it stopped. I stood up, brushed the dirt from my knees, and walked to the porch. Through the screen door, I saw Alice holding her phone to her ear. Her other hand was covering her mouth. She didn't see me. She turned away. I stood there, letting the spring air move past me like a slow current. The well inside me, whatever it was, had filled to the edge, not with rage, not with grief, but with knowing. The kind that doesn't rise all at once, but seeps. That takes the clear water of who you thought you were and clouds it with everything you've refused to name. I no longer waited for proof. Proof had become irrelevant. The water was already mixed. All I had left was what I would do with it. There was a room at the back of the house that no one entered anymore. It used to be Margaret's. Not her bedroom. She shared that with me until the very end. But her space. Her sanctuary. She called it the sewing room, though she hadn't sewed much in the last 10 years. It was more than that. It was a room where her presence lingered in soft fabrics and wooden shelves, in stacked baskets of thread and jars of buttons that clicked against glass like memories. After she passed, I closed the door gently and left it that way. I'd gone in once or twice since then, to dust, to adjust the blinds, to water the small plant she kept on the windowsill, a peace lily that surprisingly still lived, even when I forgot to water it. But I never stayed. The light in that room came through softer than the rest of the house. It wasn't the angle. It was the silence. That morning, I opened the door without thinking. Something in the rhythm of the day pushed me there. The smell of scorched toast in the kitchen, the empty teacup left out overnight, the sound of my own steps echoing too loudly through the hallway. I turned the knob and stepped inside. The air was still. Not stale, not cold, just still. As if the room had been holding its breath for me. Dust had settled on the surfaces like a thin snowfall. Her sewing table stood untouched, with a faded spool of burgundy thread sitting where she left it. The cushion on her chair still had the curve of her weight, or maybe that was just my imagination. I sat down slowly, unsure if I belonged there. The drawers still opened with that soft resistance. Inside, patterns she had torn from magazines were folded neatly, some with notes written in her small looping script. Add an inch to hem. Use softer lining. For Walter's shoulders. I ran my fingers over those notes. She had written them with purpose, with me in mind. In the corner, under the window, was a small chest. Not locked, just latched. I hadn't opened it in years. Inside were fabric squares arranged by color, a few old photo envelopes, and a slim binder with our family papers, birth certificates, property documents, our original mortgage contract, signed in blue ink on a kitchen table that no longer existed. Tucked into the back of the binder was the will. We had written it together in 2008. At the time, Adam had just started his business, and we thought we were being practical. Margaret wanted everything to go to him. He was our only child. There had been no reason to think otherwise. I remembered how she had said, "He'll take care of us when we're old," and how I had nodded, believing it completely. I removed the will from its plastic sleeve and placed it on the table. Then I retrieved a pen. The house was mine. Legally, entirely, and without dispute. Margaret's share had passed to me upon her death. I hadn't changed a thing since. But now I realized that inaction was no longer neutrality. It was consent. Consent to be forgotten in my own home. Consent to become a shadow in the margins of someone else's story. I opened the drawer in the hallway where I kept my personal documents, passport, tax returns, the folder marked legal. I pulled out a blank will form. I had printed it years ago when I thought I might travel again, just to be safe. I placed it on the desk in the old room and began to fill it out. Not in anger, not in revenge, in clarity. I listed the house, the savings, the accounts. I marked Adam's name with care, but not as the primary beneficiary. He would receive the truck, the tools, a photograph of him and his mother from the county fair. I left the rest, every room, every key, every book, every color Margaret had chosen, to the local historical society. They had once asked me to donate the house after we were gone. I had refused, thinking the family would need it. Now I saw things differently. I finished the form and signed it, slowly, deliberately. My hand did not shake. There was a knock on the front door as I was placing the document in an envelope. Not loud. 2 quick taps, then silence. I walked through the hallway and opened the door to find a man in a navy polo holding a clipboard. He was from the Historical Society. He said they were still interested, if I ever changed my mind. He handed me a pamphlet with pictures of preserved homes. I thanked him and told him I'd consider it. That night, I returned to the old room. I stood in the doorway for a long time. The light had changed. The peace lily on the windowsill leaned slightly, its leaves stretching toward the last of the afternoon sun. I watered it. I touched the frame of the window and felt the warmth of the glass. I placed the new will inside the chest, not locked, just latched, and when I left the room, I left the door open. The rain came without warning. One of those spring nights where the sky had looked too calm, too still, like it had been holding its breath all day. I had gone to bed early, or at least I had tried to. Sleep had become more of a ritual than a reality, a process I went through just to say I had done it, like brushing my teeth or turning off the lights. My body would lie still, but my mind remained restless, flipping through thoughts like old receipts. That night was no different. I lay on top of the sheets, still in my clothes, listening to the first soft taps of water against the roof. Then it picked up. Rain in this house always had a certain sound, not the gentle patter people romanticize, but something deeper, heavier, almost deliberate. Each drop struck the gutters like a slow drumbeat. It echoed through the vents, slipped beneath the window panes, whispered along the porch railings. It wasn't violent, but it wasn't kind either. It was the kind of rain that arrived with something to say. I sat up and pulled the blanket off my legs. The house was quiet, save for the storm outside. No footsteps above me, no music from the guest room, just the kind of silence that comes when even the walls are tired of listening. I stepped out into the hallway. The light from the lamppost on the street filtered in through the front windows, casting thin gold lines across the floorboards. I moved slowly, not because I was afraid of waking anyone, but because it felt wrong to rush, as though the night itself demanded reverence. The kitchen light was off. I didn't turn it on. I knew where everything was. I poured a glass of water, stood by the sink, and listened to the steady rhythm of rain on the back deck. That was when I noticed the back door. It wasn't latched. The handle was turned just slightly, enough to leave a thin crack where warm air escaped into the storm. I reached for it, paused, then pushed it open. The porch was slick with rain. The wood glistened under the dull glow of the porch light. The garden was little more than a blur, shadows and movement, and the occasional flash of silver as droplets hit the old lawn chairs. I stepped outside, barefoot, the cold biting gently at my soles. The wind curled around my ankles and slid beneath my collar. I stood there for a moment, letting the rain find my skin. Then I saw the car. It was parked across the street, engine off, headlights dark. A black sedan. No markings, no movement, just sitting there, watching, or resting. It was impossible to tell. My first thought was that someone had engine trouble, that they were waiting out the weather. But something in me said otherwise. I had seen that car before, or one just like it. I didn't move. I just stood on the porch, letting the rain soak through the shoulders of my shirt. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then, without any sign of urgency, the car pulled away. No revving engine, no rush, just a smooth, silent exit into the darkness. I stepped back inside and closed the door. I didn't lock it. Instead, I walked to the living room. The space looked different at night. The modern decor, Alice's choices, took on a colder tone. The chrome fixtures reflected light in strange ways. The couch cushions were perfectly fluffed. The magazine stack aligned. Nothing was out of place, and yet everything felt wrong, like a room designed for someone who didn't exist. I sat in my old armchair by the window and listened. The rain grew heavier. From where I sat, I could see the hallway mirror. In the reflection, just barely, I saw the outline of the guest room door. Closed. I thought of the things behind that door. Voices lowered to whispers, phones turned face down, scents that didn't belong. I thought of the drawer in Margaret's room where the new will now lay, folded next to the letter she once wrote, asking me not to let the house become hollow. The storm rattled the windows. I looked toward the fireplace. It hadn't been used in months. The wood was dry, stacked, untouched. I thought about lighting it, but something stopped me. Maybe the idea of warmth felt dishonest. Maybe I needed the cold to stay awake. The clock ticked. I hadn't heard it in weeks. Or maybe I had stopped listening. At some point, I realized I was still wet. My shirt clung to my back. My feet left prints on the floor. I didn't move. The discomfort felt earned, like penance. I thought of Gregory, of the silence between us, of how something could go so wrong and still wear the face of civility. I wondered if he had ever sat in the rain and let it wash over him without fighting it. I doubted it. Gregory never let anything touch him without reshaping it. The rain began to ease, softening into something closer to forgiveness. I stood and walked back toward the hallway. Halfway to my room, I paused. Something had shifted in the air. A door was open. The guest room. Just an inch, but enough to notice. Enough to make the hallway feel unfamiliar. I didn't approach it. I didn't want to look inside. Instead, I went back to Margaret's room. I sat in the recliner, still damp, the night's echoes following me like a shadow. The storm had passed, but the house had changed. Or maybe I had. And there, in the quiet aftermath of rain, I made a decision. Not out of emotion, not out of fear, out of clarity. The house may not have spoken aloud, but it had whispered enough. And I had heard every word. The morning after the rain was clear in a way that made everything feel overly exposed. The sky was too blue, the sun too direct, the grass too green, wet with dew that sparkled like it had something to prove. The world outside the windows looked as though it had been scrubbed clean overnight, but the inside of the house hadn't changed. The silence remained thick, like fog that refused to lift. There was something about that kind of silence, not peaceful, not restful, but tight, coiled, alert. I made coffee without looking at the clock. I didn't want to know what time it was. Some part of me had stopped keeping track. My days had become more about patterns than hours. What drawer I opened first, which step creaked, how long the kettle took to whistle. Time didn't measure anything real anymore. Not in this house. I sat at the kitchen table, the coffee cooling in front of me. I didn't drink it. My eyes kept drifting to the drawer beneath the phone. It was the drawer where we used to keep address labels and postage stamps. Margaret always said having stamps on hand was a kind of preparedness that kept you from forgetting people. That drawer hadn't been opened in years. I pulled it open slowly. The stamps were still there, though faded, curling slightly at the corners. There was a single envelope left from the old box she bought in bulk, cream-colored, smooth, with a gold edge. I slid it out and placed it on the table in front of me. I didn't know who it was for. Maybe for Gregory, maybe for Alice, maybe for myself. I reached for a pen and stared at the blank surface. There was no salutation, no opening line. I sat there for over an hour, the pen in my hand, unmoving. Words came and went. None of them settled. Everything felt too small or too loud. The letter I wanted to write wasn't one that could be sent. It wasn't even one that could be read. It was a letter shaped like a weight, a letter made of knowing. Instead of writing, I began to remember. Memory, I've found, is its own kind of message, one you read with the skin, not the eyes. I remembered a summer day when Margaret and I had argued over something so small I can't even recall the subject. She had gone into that same drawer, pulled out an envelope, and wrote me a note. She left it on my pillow. 5 sentences. No apology, no accusation, just acknowledgement. The words had been simple, but the act had been profound. She knew the power of a letter not to explain, but to confirm. Now I sat here, decades later, and couldn't find a single word that would suffice. Instead, I stood. I walked to the living room and placed the blank envelope on the coffee table. I left it there, visible, unsealed, not as a trap, not as a clue, but as a mirror. Let them wonder what it contained. Let them guess at the edges of what had gone unspoken. Sometimes what isn't written says more than any confession. Later that afternoon, I noticed Alice glance at it. Her eyes lingered on it for barely a second, but it was enough. The envelope was no longer just paper. It was presence. It was the shape of something withheld. She didn't ask. That evening, Adam came home. I heard the garage door rattle open, the sound of his keys hitting the hook by the door. He didn't speak to me, but he passed by the living room. He saw the envelope too. He paused. I could feel his gaze, though I kept mine on the window. Neither of them touched it. That was important. The next day, I moved it. I placed it on the hallway table just beneath the mirror. It stayed there all morning. Around noon, it disappeared. I never asked who took it, and no one mentioned it. That was how we lived now, without confrontation, but not without consequence. A game of omission and observation. I didn't replace it. But I wrote a new one. This time I folded the paper and placed it in an old manila envelope. I sealed it. I labeled it with a date, 1 year from today. No name, just a date. Then I walked to the old room, to Margaret's room, and tucked it into the chest where I had placed the new will. I didn't intend for anyone to find it now, but someday they would. Maybe they would read it, maybe they wouldn't, but the act of writing it was enough, of saying the unsaid, even if only to myself. There is a kind of dignity in naming things that others pretend not to see. That night, I slept with the window open. The breeze was cool, and the moon was high. I listened to the rustle of the tree branches, the creak of the house settling into its old bones. I felt the shape of my own body in the mattress, the slow rise and fall of breath I hadn't noticed in years. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a guest in my own life. The letter they never read had already been delivered, not by paper, but by silence. It didn't happen suddenly. There was no argument, no slammed door, no final straw hurled across a room. It came the way certain seasons end, not with fireworks or finality, but with quiet shifts in air, with the slow undoing of something you didn't even realize was still holding together. I began to notice it in the silences between footsteps. The mornings felt different, not in temperature, but in rhythm. The creak of the upstairs floorboards came later each day, until some mornings there were no footsteps at all. The kitchen stayed clean longer. The scent of Alice's perfume, usually the first thing to hit me when I stepped into the hallway, lingered fainter now, like a song being played from a room too far away. I didn't ask where they were going. I didn't ask if they were leaving, because the house had already started answering. Drawers that once overflowed were now half empty. The guest room closet, once packed with hanging dresses and travel bags, held more air than fabric. Boxes started to appear in the garage, sealed but unlabeled, stacked in the corner farthest from the door. I passed by them each time I took out the trash. I never looked inside. I didn't need to. One evening, I found Adam in the living room with a legal pad on his lap. His pen moved slowly across the page, pausing often. I didn't speak. He didn't look up. When I returned an hour later, the pad was gone. So was he. They began eating out more. Dinner for one became dinner for two at some distant restaurant I didn't ask about. I heard her once, on the phone, canceling a Pilates class and explaining that they'd be transitioning soon. She said the word like it meant nothing, like it was just a detail. No one asked if I needed anything. No one told me when. But I knew. The house grew quieter each day. Not empty, not yet, but lighter. Like the weight of other people's plans had begun to lift from the floorboards, from the counters, from the worn seams of the couch. And I began to breathe again. I moved with more intention. I opened blinds that had been closed for months. I took out old linens and aired them in the backyard, even though the wind caught them and nearly knocked the pins loose. I walked room to room with no purpose except to feel my presence in them. I touched objects like they were mine again, not borrowed from a life I'd been asked to wait out. On a Thursday, I found a note on the kitchen counter. It wasn't dramatic, just a folded piece of paper beside a cold cup of coffee. Adam's handwriting, short, polite, detached. They had found another place. They would begin moving this weekend. They appreciated everything. They wished me peace. There was no mention of Gregory, no mention of Alice, no mention of the things I had never said. I didn't respond. That weekend, the house came alive with motion. Not mine, theirs. Doors opened and closed, boxes shuffled, footsteps back and forth, a choreographed migration. Voices floated down the hallway, low and purposeful. I stayed out of the way. Not hidden, not banished, just still. I sat in the garden for most of it. The daffodils had returned somehow. I hadn't planted new ones. I hadn't touched that soil in years. But there they were, yellow and bright, defiant in their simplicity. I watched bees circle them like something holy. I watched the sky shift from blue to gold to bruised purple. They left in the evening. No goodbyes. The sound of the car starting was the only announcement. I didn't stand to wave. I didn't watch from the window. I listened to the tires roll over the gravel and waited until the silence settled again. Then I went inside. The guest room door stood open. It was bare. White walls, empty drawers, a forgotten coaster on the nightstand. I stood in the doorway and breathed in the nothingness they left behind. It wasn't absence. It was release. I spent the next hour walking the house, slowly, room by room. I turned on lights that had been too bright. I opened cabinets I hadn't touched since Margaret's hands last closed them. I sat in chairs they had rearranged, now returned to their proper angles. I took up space. In the hallway, I found the photograph of Margaret and me that had once hung above the fireplace, now stacked against the wall. I dusted the frame and rehung it. It wasn't just about remembering. It was about reclaiming. That night, I sat in my old armchair by the window and turned off every light. The moon spilled across the floor in silver ribbons. The shadows knew me again. The silence felt right again. They had exited slowly, and I had remained, not as a relic, but as the keeper. The first full morning without them arrived not with fanfare, but with light. It filtered in slowly through the curtains, warm, unhurried, and undemanding. There was something pure in it, something I hadn't felt in years. Not a sunrise you had to earn with labor or chase with caffeine, but a quiet unfolding, as though the house itself had finally exhaled. I sat in bed and watched the light move across the ceiling, tracing lines it hadn't touched in so long. There was no sound, not even the hum of their appliances, not the creak of unfamiliar footsteps, just the silence of light doing what it had always done. I didn't rush to get up. I lay there, arms crossed on my chest, the blanket still pulled up even though it was warm. I stared at the ceiling and listened to my own breathing. It had been a long time since I had noticed how steady it was. Even through everything, the body endures. Even when the heart folds in on itself, the breath carries forward like a quiet mule hauling invisible weight. Eventually, I rose and made the bed, smoothing the sheets with slow, firm movements, the way Margaret used to do, corners tucked, no wrinkles, no fanfare, just respect. A man doesn't need anyone watching to maintain dignity. In the hallway, the air was still cool from the night. I walked past the empty rooms, each one more quiet than the last. The guest room was exactly as they had left it, impersonal, hollow. I didn't go in. I didn't want to, yet. Not until the house decided it was time to reclaim that space. Some rooms needed to rest before being touched again. The kitchen smelled like sunlight on wood. That's the only way I can describe it. Not coffee, not toast, just warmth. I opened the blinds fully for the first time in months. Light flooded in like water, unapologetic and gold. The counter was bare. No protein shakes, no imported jars of spread, no shopping lists written in someone else's handwriting. Just the kettle, my mug, the sugar bowl with a spoon already resting in it. I made tea and didn't turn on the radio. There was no need to fill the silence. It was full on its own. I took my mug to the dining room and sat at the head of the table, the place where I used to sit before I was slowly moved aside by gestures too polite to be named. The chair welcomed me back like it had been waiting. I sat upright, both feet planted on the floor, and drank slowly. The photo of Margaret and me had returned to the wall the night before. I had rehung it after the house went still, after the last box was gone, after the last engine faded down the street. She looked different now in the morning light, less like memory, and more like witness, as if she were seeing what I had done and nodding, without judgment, just knowing. After breakfast, I walked to the old room, her room. I opened the door and let the air move past me. It didn't resist. The curtains moved gently, as if welcoming me again. I stood in the doorway for a while, then crossed the threshold and sat in the chair by the window. The peace lily on the sill was still alive. I turned the pot slightly so it could face the sun more directly. Margaret used to say that every living thing deserved the full face of light at least once a day, even the tired ones, especially the tired ones. I pulled open her drawer and found the envelope again, the will, the letter, the folded note with my name on it. I didn't open them. I knew what they said. I only needed to touch them, not for validation, but for continuity. Paper, like people, holds warmth when held with intent. Back in the hallway, I passed by the small mirror near the coat hooks. I hadn't looked directly at myself in a while. Not really. But this morning, I did. I looked into my own eyes and saw not the man who had been pushed aside, not the man who had been tolerated for convenience, but the man who had stayed, the one who had endured, the one who still knew every creak in the floor and every shift in light from room to room. The phone didn't ring that day. No visitors came. No cars slowed outside. And yet, I didn't feel forgotten. I felt returned. That afternoon, I brought down the old tablecloth, the one with the red edges and the small burn mark from a candle too close to the edge. I laid it across the dining table and pressed the wrinkles out with my palm. I set the sugar bowl in the center. I brought down Margaret's favorite teacup and placed it beside my own. I didn't drink from it. I just left it there, a gesture, a remembering. Later, I walked out into the garden. The earth was soft from the rain. The air held that post-storm clarity that made everything smell sharper. I knelt by the daffodils and pulled a few weeds. My knees ached, but not in a way that asked for pity. In a way that reminded me I was still here. I stayed outside until the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the fence. Then I stood, wiped my hands on my pants, and went back inside. The house welcomed me the way only a house without pretense can. I closed the back door softly behind me and turned off the porch light. That evening, I didn't turn on any lamps. I let the dark come as it wanted. Slow, natural. I sat in my chair by the window and watched the light fade from the sky, watched the first stars blink uncertainly into place. There was no music, no noise, no interruption, only the silence of light leaving the room. And it was beautiful.